The Pro Farmer Tour said, let's hope there is a lot of growing season left because if not, we have bigger problems. Weather conditions are going to have a major impact from this point forward. And weather is something that I wanted to talk to you about in this video, and I'm going to bring up a lot of stats and information so that we can try and project what the chances are of an early freeze. The Pro Farm Tour just got done with their tour. I know the USDA left the tour early due to some threats. I don't think that threatening the USDA is going to do anything when it comes to corn prices. The USDA, as I've said in several of my videos before in the past, they're not into forecasting the weather. What they're looking at are the crops that are in the ground, what their potential yield is, and they're really only looking at those Midwest crops. And I'm going to talk a little bit of a difference between some of the Midwest crops and some of the southern crops in a minute, but they're judging those crops because they encompass such a large percentage of the crops in the U.S. And just because those crops were planted late does not mean that they aren't growing. But the farm tour tells us about those crops is actually very, very important, and it could play into a lot of what the USDA releases going forward. This is an agency that is not into weather forecasting. They're not looking at probabilities of early first frosts and things like that. What they're looking at is how much corn got into the ground and is growing now. And that's what their forecasts are based on. And that's why we can't really look at the USDA forecasts and expect that to be our outcome in December. We have to look at a much bigger picture. I think the Pro Farmer Tour definitely gave us some insight into that.
You know, the 13.9 billion bushel number that we got from USDA back in on August 12 was about what, 700 million bushels above the average trade guess?
Yes.
Well, here we are at 13.36. We're not quite that 700 million bushels below. We're getting close. We're getting close to that.
They lowered the yield estimates from the USDA from 169 to about 163. That was a much lower yield than what the USDA had. It wasn't quite in line with, I think, how bearish as far as supply goes that the market was looking for, but it was definitely lower and closer in line to what the market was expecting.
I think this lines up pretty well with those expectations, a whole lot better than that 13.9 number did.
Yeah, obviously USDA's August estimate came in much higher than anticipated and stirred the markets, stirred emotions and everything else.
They also significantly dropped soybeans. So soybeans are something that I think everybody kind of felt were below the average. You were having 60 pods versus 100 pods per plant. It wasn't looking like soybeans were yielding nearly as much as expectations. Now, one of the comments that they mentioned on the tour was that they were measuring potential yield versus last year they were measuring realized yield. And what that means is that the plants that they were measuring were immature. So they couldn't really tell what the maturity would be. They were measuring what the maturity potential would be of those plants. The big key point here is that when they did the Pro Farmer Tour last year, around the same time, they were looking at mature plants with realized yields. This year they were looking at potential yields of immature plants. The Pro Farmer Tour said, let's hope there is a lot of growing season left because if not, we have bigger problems. Weather conditions are going to have a major impact from this point forward. And weather is something that I wanted to talk to you about in this video, and I'm going to bring up a lot of stats and information so that we can try and project what the chances are of an early freeze. I also did just want to throw in here, and this isn't a conspiracy theory, but it's just an interesting note. The Russian spy plane flight that occurred just a week or two before the Pro Farmer Tour flew across a similar route to the Pro Farmer Tour. They hooked up a little further east to check out a naval base on Lake Michigan, but they definitely flew across some of that Midwest area. And if you look back to Russia's actions in '72 the wheat crisis of, what was it, 2010? I think I got those dates right. But Russia is not, they play games with everything. And grains are one of those games that if they play their cards right, they can wreak havoc on the global economy. And that is something that Russia has done on numerous occasions. Now, I will say that most of the time that they're doing it to the benefit of the people of Russia. When it comes to politicians, somebody as long-term as Putin, with as much control as Putin, and the fact that he was in intelligence for most of his life, he is one of the smartest leaders globally, regardless of whether or not he's a tyrant. So when he is paying attention to things like crops, we should be paying attention to things like crops, because if he makes a move, if he buys up, excess corn in one area or something, it could drastically damage the global supply. And they have done that numerous times in the past. And I just found it very ironic that their spy plane route went over part of the Midwest when they flew last month. Hot wars are a different video that I'm going to talk about. Wars between countries nowadays aren't necessarily fought with guns and ammo. They're often fought with strategy. Hot wars are war games not necessarily meant to be malicious, but to protect supplies for the citizens of that country. So I would watch Putin's moves. I have a feeling that when they were flying over the Midwest states, they had their eyes on the grains as well. I also do a lot of work across the state of North Carolina. The past few weeks, Shauna and I have spent a lot of time driving through the Piedmont region. Most of the corn in North Carolina is grown out east, but there is a lot of corn that is grown in the Piedmont region. And something that I've noticed in driving is that corn is at all different stages of life. North Carolina was a late plant state as well, so the corn conditions here aren't going to be the same as they are in Iowa, because we're down south, and our corn has had to go through a warmer summer season than the Midwest. So the corn that I'm seeing is going to be different than the Midwest, but I think it's important to touch on this because it's going to show you how weather can affect these yields. Some of the crops that I have seen are so immature, they still don't have ears on them. I walked out in a field that looked like a beautiful field from the road, very tall stalks, but as I walked through the field, I did not see any ears on those stalks. Right now, we are approaching the time when we should be harvesting corn in North Carolina. So that is not a good sign. And I would say that I saw many fields that were in that condition. The other thing I noticed is that in some of the mature fields, the stalks were much shorter. They only had 1 to 2 ears on them. They were very dried out already. And it's not unusual to start to see the corn plants start to dry out this time of year if they were planted on time. What is unusual is the yield of those plants. They obviously have suffered from the stress of heat. The reason why they suffered from the stress of the summer heat is not because of global warming, but it's because of the late planting. The roots didn't have time to support the plant life during the warmer season. And that is something that I have seen in a lot of corn crops across the South. So what I've seen driving around the Piedmont is that approximately 50% of the cornfields that I have seen and stopped and looked at were at the point where they looked like they were in decent condition heading into the harvest season. The rest were either way below on yields or just hadn't even began silking out, which is, I think, highly unfortunate. But hopefully, being in the South, some of those less mature plants will have time to mature, and maybe, because of their current stage of growth, they'll have a better shot. It's all going to come down to the first frost. Weather has also been affecting some crops further north in the Midwest, and actually as far north as Canada. The Canadian corn capital recently had a hailstorm that devastated some of the corn crops there. They had a big corn festival with no corn. Sully County in South Dakota had hundreds of acres destroyed in a hailstorm recently, and then also Knox County in Nebraska got devastated by some hailstorms. Another recent discovery in southern Nebraska has been the southern rust disease in corn, and that is something that has been prevalent in a lot of the corn crops in Missouri and Indiana in the weeks prior to that. So we could expect that southern rust to kind of expand a little bit and continue to grow, and that's going to cause some yield issues. Southern rust is caused by Pusina polysora fungus, which is a fungus that thrives in cool, humid temperatures. And so I think that the southern rust is another sign of something that we should be a lot more concerned about, because southern rust won't necessarily destroy the plants. It will affect yields, but the fact that the fungus itself is one that thrives in cool, humid environments points to a couple other conditions that we should pay attention to heading into the fall, and that is an early frost. The humidity and extra moisture that we've seen this year, and the moisture has helped the crops during the summertime. I'm going to relate this to 1995, when we saw a lot of crop failure in the corn and soybeans due to late planting. They looked fantastic, but then as we got into the fall, we had an early frost and it just wreaked havoc on the crops, and we had a very, very, very poor crop season. And I think that this is lining up to be very similar to 95. 95 was a lunar year, and what we have noticed is that moisture tends to be more prevalent on lunar years. The lunar cycle is every 18 years, and so that cycle in and of itself isn't an indicator of an early frost, but it is an indicator of that extra moisture. And when you have an early frost, what you're looking at is the potential of that moisture mixing with the cool air, and then obviously when you get below 28 degrees, you kind of have that death freeze on the crops. In trying to determine the potential of an early frost, I also looked at the solar minimum years and years in which we have experienced solar frost. And while there's not a direct correlation to lunar years, and I think the lunar years is kind of a long-going myth among farmers that that part of the lunar cycle is going to have a dramatic impact on crops and an early frost. But what I have found is that it's when the lunar years coincide with the solar minimum years that you have that early frost potential. And it's a very high early frost potential. 1965, 1974, 1983, 1995, and actually 1942. All of those years were solar minimum years. Every single one of those years had an early freeze. Now, the difference between a freeze and a frost is that an early freeze is when temperatures drop below 28 degrees and the ground actually freezes. A freeze will actually kill the crops, whereas a frost is going to cause damage to the yields. During solar minimum years, we have this potential of an early freeze. 1965, 1983, and 2001 were lunar years when we could expect early frosts. That's the humidity mixing with the cooler temperatures of September and causing a surface frost. The freeze is definitely, in most cases, looking at Iowa records, you can have a frost well before a freeze, but in most cases the frost and freeze do coincide within a day or two. What I'm trying to figure out is what is our potential in 2019 of having an early frost or freeze. And based on the solar cycles, it would seem that almost every minimum solar cycle we have early frosts and early freezes. So I would say that of the years I studied, we have over an 83% chance of an early freeze this fall. By early freeze, I'm talking about within the next 30 days, we could start to see frosts and freezes in the Midwest. Doing just a quick search on the internet, those freeze dates in 1995 were around September 22nd, 21st, 22nd, 23rd. In that time range, we saw early freezes across the Midwest, which devastated crops in 95. This is actually a pretty big deal when you have this many immature plants. When the Pro Farmer Tour says we had to measure potential yields because if plants were too immature, and we're at the end of August, we're looking at the potential of freezing between mid-September and before the end of September, a very high percentage chance of an early freeze and early frost. The frost, again, could come earlier than the freeze. The frost is going to damage yields. The freeze is just going to flat out kill the yields of these plants. I did look at kind of on a grander scale. We had a similar effect in 1916 and 1928. The difference in those years is that it wasn't a solar minimum period. Solar cycle 15 and 16 were weaker cycles. The cycles that we've been seeing would coincide more with solar cycle 15 and 16, and actually we could be heading into a weaker cycle than those periods. But that was a dip in solar activity during those two cycles, and we saw freezes occurring almost at the maximum periods, early freezes. That tells us that the weaker solar cycles in general have a higher chance of having an early freeze or frost. And then when you combine that with the data from the solar minimum periods, there's almost you're almost pushing yourself up to 100% certainty of an early freeze or frost. I think it's important that we never try and predict the future. What we're trying to do is what I'm trying to do is discuss the future, discuss what could potentially happen, look at the past, and judging from the past, you could say with almost certainty that will happen in the future, but the future hasn't happened yet. None of us are prophets, okay? But what we can do is we can look at the past, and we can look at the climate data from the past, and compare the events that were happening to what's happening now to try and help determine the future. And this is important for farmers because farmers have to figure out how to manage their crops and how to get the most out of those crops. And I think if there's a way that they can get in there and kind of push their limits to get it out a little earlier, they're gonna make out a little better than if they wait and try and see the crop to full maturity. So that means, smaller corn, lower yields. I think that farmers are going to do that. The smart ones probably are, if they're paying attention to this stuff. Again, you can't say that with 100% certainty because we're not prophets. I'm not a prophet. I can't walk on water. I can't tell you what's going to happen, but I can tell you from looking at the previous solar cycles and the information that's out there, solar minimums lead to early frosts. Weak solar cycles lead to early frosts. Lunar cycles lead to excess moisture. CO2 has had no impact on any of these. In fact, I found an interesting chart that compared, it was talking about, a 100-year span, and they had taken a trend line for the first 50 years between 1900 and the 1950s, and a trend line from the 50s on for early frosts. And the averages were relatively the same. So if you're thinking with warming, the chances of an early frost are substantially lower. Not according to the average trend lines taken from those two 50-year periods. Closest 50-year period is no different than the previous. What does seem to have more of an impact on our crops are these solar cycles. Even the long-term solar cycles, when you look at 1916 and 1928, we have data for where we went through a weaker solar cycle period. There were earlier frosts, which affected crops. Almost every single year that I looked at during a minimum period, or particularly going into the solar minimum, we had these early frosts, early freezes that wreaked havoc on our crops. With almost certainty, we can look at these immature crops and the potential of freeze within the next 30 days and say it's there, which according to the Pro Farmer Tour is drastically going to change their yield potentials. Again, I think that some of the anger thrown out at the USDA, Sonny Perdue didn't help any of that. I mean, Sonny Perdue is a good old boy, and I can't speak too poorly of good old boys. It's not a circle that, being in the South, I haven't run into and been friendly with, but he's a little bit like Trump. He doesn't think about the things that he says. He is a bit, in my opinion, selfish. I mean, the guy switched parties just to get ahead with his political career. He's not loyal in any one direction. In my opinion, he is not the best or most suitable person for the position that he's in. However, he does have a lot of crop experience. He does have a lot of big business experience. I can see why he is where he is. That said, his joke that he made, the wine cellar joke, which was basically he asked a group of farmers, what do you call a couple farmers in a basement? A wine cellar. I mean, clearly he wasn't thinking when he said that. And I think that his demeanor sometimes, his lack of jokes, and I can't speak to the lack of jokes because I tell bad jokes all the time. My wife is constantly getting on me about telling jokes that are hurtful, and I think that they're funny, and I'm just trying to, lighten the situation. I actually think he may have been trying to do that. Like I said, I think those guys in the current administration, although some of their policies don't seem all that bad, their jokes, the things they say, are highly inappropriate. But that isn't a reason to put forth frustration and anger at the USDA. They're doing their job the way that they're reporting. They can't be prophets either. What you have to do is take the information that they're giving you and make a call of judgment off of that. And in one of my last videos, I encouraged people to read articles written by meteorologists and people who are talking about the potential of an early fall frost. Not everybody agrees that there will be one, but most of the astrologists would say there's definitely a potential, and there's definitely, unmistakably, there is a correlation between solar cycles and early frosts. Cooler September temperatures, the summer months, you can't really look at it and say, well, we had a hot July, so we're not gonna have an early frost. I mean, that's just ridiculous. That's not how it works. There have been as many years where we've had an early frost that we had a cool August or a warm August. The most important month when it comes to early frosts is September, and then the most important cycle seems to be that solar cycle, and then the lunar cycle adds to the impact of that, the chances of that, with what appears to be an increase in humidity during lunar years. I will say that, a lot of people are concerned about trade. Well, the Pro Farmer Tour suggested a 7% drop in yields from last year. We only trade out about 14% of our corn. And I don't know how much of that goes to China versus other countries, but I'm guessing we've eaten up most of what we would trade out to China in just that 7% yield drop. Not to mention the increase in demand. Every single year, our increase in demand goes up. I think that they have tried to offset some of that demand by handing out more waivers for ethanol use this year. Those waivers aren't a yearly thing. It's a way of managing the cycle. So there's been a lot of anger over those waivers to ethanol companies. Personally, I think that ethanol is a worthless fuel. I support supporting farmers, and I drive a flex fuel vehicle, and when it makes sense, I buy ethanol. Right now, I don't think that the prices in corn are justifying the offset of a trade war with China or a few extra ethanol waivers handed out, especially with the current trade deal we just made with Japan. I think what we need to look out for now is that early frost, early freeze. My expectations are it's been pretty cold lately for August. It's been in the 70s here in North Carolina. It's been beautiful. I love weather in the 70s, especially in August. I think this will be followed by another heat wave. And then following that heat wave, which will probably last a week and a half to 2 weeks, I think we'll get hit with another cold front. And when that cold front hits, I would say mid-September, that's when we need to start looking out for that frost and that freeze. If it hits a little earlier, we might push off that frost or freeze towards the end of September. But if it hits a little later, I think we have a very high chance of having an even, if we get a cold front coming in around the 15th or a little later of September, I think we have a high chance of a frost or a freeze occurring as early as that time frame. So that's scary thought to think about when you think about immature crops, but this is just the reality of what we're facing. A lot of humidity in the air mixed with some cooler temperatures drastically increases the potential of a frost, which will lower our yields, will damage our yields substantially. And then, of course, if we end up getting sub 28 degree temperatures early morning for any extended period of time, it will just flat out. Those are what we call the crop killers, the freezes. But below 35 degrees is going to damage our yields right now. So we're heading in that direction, and I think that based on all of the data that I have reviewed and studied, the chances, just being a solar minimum year, over 83%. When you add in the weaker solar cycles, and you end up with nearly 100% chance. But like I said, I'm not a prophet. You're not a prophet. Nobody's a prophet. Nobody can predict these things. I could be completely wrong. I wouldn't say could be completely wrong. Statistically, there's statistics there that support the theory, but that doesn't mean it has to happen. It's just this is what seems to be lining up and seems to be something that we should all be preparing for. And that's what my videos are about, our preparation, what you can be doing to prepare for, if you're a farmer, for an early frost. And then also, with the bigger scheme of things, if we are going into a grand solar minimum, what you can do individually to prepare for what could end up being a food shortage. Because if we continue to have years like this, we are going to see yields drop. And with our rising population, we need to be seeing yields rise, not drop. So that's going to just the increased demand with a stagnant supply would cause a food crisis. If our food supply begins to go down from where we have had it, that's just going to amplify that food crisis. And I think that we're heading in that direction where we're going to see yields drop for a period of time. And if that continues on for 30 years, then that's where you're going to have some extreme situations occur. All of these things are things that are important for us to think about. Some of these guys that are out there talking about nationalizing energy and nationalizing, our food sources so that we can control the CO2 in the environment are extremely dangerous individuals. I try not to talk too much about politics. You know who they are. Not even everybody in their party agrees with them. In fact, I've seen some presidential candidates drop out of the race because of how extreme some of these people are. And it's pseudoscience. It's not real, but these solar cycles are real. The data's there. It supports it. This year, we should be preparing for a weaker crop. We need to make those preparations now.